It was a crisp December evening in a quiet New York neighborhood, where the streets sparkled with twinkling lights and the air smelled faintly of fresh pine. People were bustling about, their energy a mix of holiday excitement and the usual rush. Yet, inside a modest apartment just a few blocks away, the cheer of the season felt distant and out of reach. Ellen Parker sat alone at her kitchen table, wrapped in the quiet stillness of her home. The only light came from a strand of Christmas lights above her window, casting a soft glow over the room. Her fingers curled tightly around a mug of lukewarm coffee, the steam long gone. In the next room, her two children, Adam and Lucy, played quietly. Their hushed voices drifted through the air, adding to the calm that enveloped the apartment. It was a world away from the holiday spirit that seemed to be everywhere else. This Christmas was different, difficult in ways Ellen hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, there was no Christmas tree, no presents. Bills stacked up on the counter, unpaid and demanding attention, threatening to take away the stability they barely had left. Ellen had picked up extra shifts at the diner where she worked, but it was never enough. The weight of it all hung over her like a cloud, and no matter how hard she worked, the holiday season only made her feel more like a failure. But Ellen wasn't the type to sit back and accept defeat. As she gazed out the frost-covered window, an idea began to form. A bold one, even a little crazy, but sometimes desperation sparks the wildest ideas. What if she wrote to Donald Trump? Not as a former president, but as a man who had built a life on business, connections, and the kind of confidence she desperately needed right now. She wasn't asking for charity. She wasn't even asking for help in the traditional sense. What she wanted was advice. She hoped that perhaps, just maybe, he could share some wisdom that might give her the push she needed to turn things around. It was a long shot. She knew that. But in the midst of everything, it felt like the only option left. After all, what did she have to lose? And so, Ellen sat down and began to write a letter that would unknowingly set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. Introduction of protagonist's background. Ellen Parker was the kind of person who always kept fighting. Growing up in a small town in the Midwest, she understood early on that nothing in life came easy. Her father worked as a mechanic, often staying late into the night to fix cars, while her mother juggled long shifts as a nurse, doing everything she could to support the family. Watching them, Ellen learned that hard work and resilience were the keys to survival. But as much as she admired her parents' strength, she didn't expect life to be quite as tough as it turned out. By 29, Ellen was navigating life as a single mother after her marriage to her high school sweetheart crumbled. Her husband, unable to handle the pressures of parenthood, left, leaving Ellen to raise their two kids, Adam and Lucy, on her own. Adam, an 8-year-old with a quiet love for reading, and Lucy, a curious 5-year-old with endless energy, were her world. They were the reason she kept pushing no matter how difficult things got. Their apartment, though small and modest, was filled with love. The walls were covered with handmade art projects and family photos, little reminders of the bond they shared. Ellen worked as a waitress at a local diner, a job that just barely covered the basics. Every morning she woke up before sunrise to pack lunches, iron clothes, and get the kids ready for school. Then she'd head off to a grueling 10-hour shift at the diner, always on her feet and always doing her best to keep up. Despite the long hours, Ellen made time for Adam and Lucy. She read to them every night, helped Adam with his schoolwork, and patiently answered Lucy's never-ending questions. Yet, as hard as she tried, the weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, rent was due, and grocery money was always tight. There were days when she couldn't afford to eat so the kids could have enough. It wasn't that Ellen couldn't handle the work, it was the guilt. It crushed her to see the disappointment in her children's eyes when she couldn't say yes to things they wanted. Clothes, trips, even just small treats like an ice cream cone seemed out of reach. This Christmas was the hardest yet. Ellen had already explained to Adam and Lucy that Santa might be extra busy this year, but she could see the sadness in their eyes. They were too young to fully understand, but Ellen knew they could feel the weight of the holiday expectations. Still, Ellen didn't let herself give up. She found joy in the little moments, Adam's quiet hugs, Lucy's infectious laugh, the warmth of them cuddling up next to her on the couch during movie nights. These moments kept her grounded, reminding her why she kept going. Ellen's strength wasn't just about surviving, it was rooted in her belief in hard work and kindness. She held on to the lessons her parents had taught her. No matter how tough things got, there was always a way to make things better. She carried that belief with her into everything she did. It was what drove her to take on extra shifts, even when her body begged for rest. It was the same belief that kept her dreaming of a better life, even when it felt so far out of reach. One person who always had Ellen's back was her neighbor, Mrs. Hawkins, an elderly widow who had lived next door for over 20 years. Mrs. Hawkins was more than just a neighbor, she was a friend and confidant. She helped watch the kids when Ellen had to work late, and whenever Ellen needed someone to talk to, Mrs. Hawkins was there with an open ear. "You've got a fire in you, Ellen," she would often say. "Don't let the world put it out." One night, as they sat together over cups of tea, Ellen shared an idea that had been growing in her mind for weeks: writing to Donald Trump. Mrs. Hawkins raised an eyebrow but didn't dismiss it outright. "Well, you've got nothing to lose," she said with a shrug. "Sometimes you've got to take a leap of faith." Ellen wasn't sure what she hoped for when she wrote that letter. Maybe it was a long shot, but she wasn't asking for charity, just advice. She wanted guidance, something that might help her build a better future for her kids. And so, with trembling hands and a heart full of hope, she picked up a pen and began to write. It wasn't just for herself that Ellen wrote the letter, it was for Adam and Lucy too. She wanted them to know that even in the darkest times, it was okay to reach out for help. She wanted to show them that courage wasn't always about doing what was easy, it was about doing what scared you most. Even when things felt hopeless, there was always a glimmer of hope to hold on to. As Ellen wrote, she couldn't help but wonder if this small act of faith might be the turning point she desperately needed. After all, she had nothing to lose and everything to gain. An act of kindness that changes everything. Ellen's shift at the diner had started just like any other, chaotic, with the lunch crowd filling the small space. The familiar faces of regulars sat in their usual spots, while newcomers took in the bustling atmosphere. Ellen moved quickly from table to table, balancing plates of food and refilling coffee cups. Her legs were sore and she could feel the exhaustion creeping into her bones, but she powered through, focusing on the work that needed to be done. It wasn't until the end of the rush that she noticed him. A man sitting alone by the window, his weathered coat almost blending into the chilly ambience of the diner. His hands were wrapped tightly around a cup of water, as if it was the only thing holding him together. The lines on his face told stories of hardship that Ellen could relate to all too well. "Excuse me, sir, are you ready to order?" she asked gently, her voice quiet, understanding that he probably wasn't there to eat. He glanced up, his eyes darting between the menu and the busy scene around him. After a moment he shook his head. I'm good with just the water." "Thank you," he mumbled, almost as if the words took more effort than they should. Ellen's heart sank. She saw the pride in his eyes, the kind of pride that made it difficult for someone to ask for help, even when they needed it the most. It was the same pride she had carried for years, the kind that made her refuse to accept charity, even when everything in her life felt like it was falling apart. But something about this man's quiet dignity hit her deeply. Without a second thought, she turned around and made her way to the kitchen, determined to offer something more than just sympathy. She grabbed a steaming bowl of chicken soup, a slice of fresh bread and a small side of mashed potatoes. It wasn't much, but it was a warm meal, and to someone who seemed like they had been going without, it might be everything. When Ellen placed the plate in front of him, she smiled. "On the house," she said before he could protest. "You can't face the cold out there on an empty stomach." The man looked up in surprise, his face softening as he processed her words. I can't let you do that," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Ellen shook her head. "Everyone deserves a warm meal, especially today. No strings attached." He paused for a moment, looking at her as though he wasn't sure how to respond. Finally he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." As he began to eat, Ellen returned to her work, her heart lightening despite the fatigue that weighed her down. It wasn't the first time she had helped someone in need, and it wouldn't be the last. She knew what it felt like to struggle, to be on the edge, unsure of where the next meal would come from or how to make it through another day. Her own troubles hadn't magically disappeared, but she felt a deep sense of fulfillment in knowing that her small gesture might make his day just a little bit better. Later, as she cleaned up after her shift, Ellen thought about the man's grateful smile. Mrs. Hawkins' words echoed in her mind, "Don't let the world put out your fire." The moment felt significant in a way Ellen hadn't expected. She realized that her strength wasn't just about enduring the tough times, it was also about lifting others up, even when her own life felt heavy. When she got home that evening, Ellen was greeted by her kids, who had been spending the afternoon with Mrs. Hawkins. Lucy immediately ran up to her, holding a picture she'd drawn of a magical unicorn, while Adam proudly showed off the perfect score he'd gotten on his spelling test. Seeing their joy and hearing about their little victories reminded Ellen of the importance of the small moments. These were the things that made the struggles worth it. Over tea, as Ellen shared the details of her day with Mrs. Hawkins, The older woman nodded approvingly. "You've got a good heart, Ellen," she said. "The world could use more of that." Ellen shrugged, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I don't know if it changes much, but it feels right. Sometimes kindness is all we have." That simple meal had cost Ellen nothing but a few minutes of her time and a small portion of her energy. But to the man sitting alone by the window, it had meant everything. In a world where every day seemed like an uphill battle, it was moments like these that reminded Ellen of the power of kindness and human connection. This wasn't just about one act of generosity. It was about the ripple effect of small actions that, together, could change someone's life. A turning point twist. The snow had fallen overnight, covering the streets in a thick layer of frost, making the morning walk to the diner feel even colder than usual. Ellen pulled her scarf tighter against the biting wind, trying to shake off the fatigue from another long day ahead. But there was something in her step that morning, something that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, today would be different. When she arrived at the diner, she was surprised by how quiet it was. Usually there was a buzz of activity, but this morning the place felt almost empty. Phil, her manager, greeted her with an unexpected grin. "Big shots coming today," he said, nodding toward the counter, which gleamed from a fresh polish, and the crisp white tablecloths that had been set out. "Some journalist or author wants to interview the staff. Make sure you're on your best behavior." Ellen chuckled. "Always am," she replied, tying her apron and rolling up her sleeves. The rest of the morning passed as usual, until the lunchtime rush. That's when the man walked in. At first, Ellen didn't recognize him. But as soon as he caught her eye, something clicked. It was the same man she'd served just the night before, the one she had given a warm meal to without question. Now, here he was, walking into the diner as if he belonged, his tailored coat and confident stride a stark contrast to the humble setting around him. Ellen's breath caught in her throat. What was he doing here? Had he come back to thank her? To repay her? The questions raced through her mind. Phil rushed over, his face flushed with surprise. "Ellen, that's Maxwell Reed," he whispered. "He's one of those self-made billionaire types. Writes books about life and success. What's he doing here?" Ellen's mind went blank. Maxwell Reed? The same author whose books she had seen on the shelves at the library? She could hardly believe it. Last night, he had been a man struggling, looking for something, maybe just a moment of peace. He hadn't seemed like the kind of person who would attract so much attention. Maxwell spotted her immediately, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Ellen, right?" She nodded, still processing everything. "Yes, that's me. I didn't recognize you last night." He smiled again, his tone softer this time. "I wasn't exactly myself. I came here looking for answers, but instead I found something better. Kindness." Before Ellen could respond, Maxwell turned toward the other diners, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have a moment of your time," he began. The room quieted as he spoke. Maxwell shared the story of the previous evening, describing how Ellen had shown him kindness without expecting anything in return. He spoke about her selflessness, how she had given him a meal, simply because she could. "What struck me most," he continued, his eyes fixed on Ellen, was that Ellen didn't offer a grand gesture. She offered something far rarer, genuine kindness. And that's a gift in a world that often forgets the power of simple acts of compassion. The diner fell silent. Ellen's co-workers, the regulars, everyone watched in stunned silence. Maxwell wasn't just recounting her actions. He was elevating them, turning a quiet moment of kindness into something larger than life. "People like Ellen," he went on, "remind us that it's not the grand gestures that change lives. It's the small, selfless acts that ripple outward, creating waves of hope." When he finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Ellen, overwhelmed by the attention, felt a rush of emotions. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to fall, but she smiled through them. The surprises didn't stop there. Maxwell stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I'd like to share your story, Ellen. Not just here but with the world. People need to see what real kindness looks like." "Share my story?" Ellen repeated, confused. "What do you mean?" "I want to include it in my next book," Maxwell said. "And beyond that, I'd like to help. For starters, I'll cover the rest of the month's rent. Consider it my way of paying forward what you gave me last night." Ellen's hand flew to her mouth, her heart racing. I don't know what to say. That's too much." "It's not enough," Maxwell said, his voice firm. "You deserve so much more, Ellen. And this is only the beginning." By the time her shift ended, word had spread about Maxwell's visit. Reporters, curious onlookers. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. Ellen's life, once defined by quiet struggle, was suddenly in the spotlight. It felt surreal, but in some strange way she couldn't help but feel grateful for it. That night, as she sat with Adam and Lucy in their small apartment, she recounted the events of the day. Adam's eyes lit up with excitement. "Does this mean we're famous now, Mom?" Alan laughed, ruffling his hair. "Not famous, sweetheart. But maybe it means things are looking up." For Ellen, this twist in her story wasn't just about her newfound recognition or the unexpected turn in her circumstances. It was a reminder of the incredible power of kindness and how a simple act, one that came from the heart, could have a ripple effect that changed everything. For the first time in a long time, Ellen allowed herself to believe that a brighter future wasn't just a dream. It was possible. And it all started with a meal shared at the right moment. After Maxwell Reed's visit, Ellen's life seemed to shift overnight. What was once a small, overlooked diner became a local sensation. People from all over the city flocked to the diner, drawn by the story of the woman whose kindness had caught the attention of a billionaire author. Some came just to meet her, others to thank her, and a few even shared their own struggles and hopes. Despite the sudden spotlight, Ellen remained humble. She served her customers with the same dedication as always, though there was no denying that her life was changing in ways she hadn't imagined. Maxwell had promised to include her story in his book, and he kept his word. He didn't stop at covering her rent for the month, he went far beyond that. A gift beyond expectations. One evening, Maxwell knocked on Ellen's door, and when she opened it, he handed her an envelope. "This isn't charity," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's recognition of what you represent. I've set up a fund in your name, dedicated to supporting single parents like you who refuse to give up, no matter how tough life gets." Ellen's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside, there was a letter explaining the fund, along with a grant that was more than she could have ever hoped for. It was enough to cover her immediate needs and help her take a step toward her dreams, giving Adam and Lucy a better life. "Maxwell, I can't accept this," she said, shaking her head. "I've never asked for anything like this." "You didn't have to," Maxwell replied gently. "Your kindness spoke louder than words. Let this be a way for others to find hope, just as you gave me a reason to believe in humanity again." For the first time in years, Ellen allowed herself to dream. She enrolled Adam in after-school programs he'd always wanted to join and signed Lucy up for art classes. The joy in their faces filled Ellen with a sense of fulfillment she'd never experienced before. Giving back, the birth of Warm Hearts Night. But Ellen didn't stop there. She used part of the grant to start a community initiative, something that had been in her heart for a long time. Every Friday evening she hosted Warm Hearts Night at the diner, providing free meals to those in need. The event quickly became a beacon of hope in the community, attracting neighbors who volunteered to help and local musicians who offered to perform. Through these gatherings, Ellen met people who were struggling in ways that reminded her of her own past. There was Mrs. Lopez, an elderly widow who found comfort in the company of others, and Jake, a young man who had been unemployed for months but found a job through connections made at the diner. Ellen had become not just a waitress, but a source of inspiration for those around her. One evening, as Ellen walked home with Adam and Lucy, her son looked up at her with a question. "Mom," Adam asked, "why do you always help people even when things were hard for us?" Ellen knelt down to his level, her voice steady and full of love. "Because, Adam, kindness doesn't just help others, it helps us too. When we give, we remind ourselves that we're not alone, that we're part of something bigger." Adam nodded thoughtfully, his young mind starting to grasp the lesson. Ellen smiled, knowing that she had planted a seed in his heart, a lesson that would stay with him for life. The ripple effect of kindness. Maxwell's book, Ripples of Kindness, was released a few months later. Ellen's story was featured as the centerpiece, highlighting how a small, selfless act could create a wave of positive change. The book resonated with readers across the country, sparking a wave of kindness initiatives. One day, a social worker walked into the diner, introduced herself, and shared that Ellen's story had inspired her to start a mentorship program for struggling parents. "Your story is helping so many," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Ellen's eyes filled with tears as she realized the far-reaching impact of her simple act of kindness. The chain of events that had started with a warm meal on a cold winter night had grown into something far beyond what she could have ever imagined. A legacy of compassion. As the years passed, Ellen's life continued to flourish. The diner remained a beloved gathering place, and Warm Hearts Night became a cherished tradition. Adam and Lucy grew up with the values of compassion and resilience that their mother had instilled in them. They carried those lessons with them into their adult lives, always remembering the importance of helping others. Ellen often thought back to that pivotal night when she had offered a meal to a stranger in need. She marveled at how that small, seemingly insignificant gesture had sparked a chain of events that not only transformed her own life but also touched countless others. In the end, Ellen's story wasn't just about her journey, it was about the power of kindness to bridge divides, uplift spirits, and create ripples of change. She had once been a struggling single mother, fighting to survive. But through her compassion and resilience, she had become a symbol of hope and inspiration for her community and beyond. As she watched her children thrive, surrounded by love and opportunity, Ellen knew that the greatest reward of all was seeing the impact of a life lived with an open heart. Ellen's story is a powerful reminder of how the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples that change lives in ways we can't always predict. What started with a simple warm meal for a stranger on a cold night didn't just shift Ellen's world, it transformed the lives of everyone around her. Her journey proves that even a small act of compassion can have far-reaching effects. Why kindness matters. Take a moment to reflect on your own life. Is there someone in your world who could benefit from a helping hand or a kind word? Think about the impact one small gesture could have on their day and on their life. Ellen's story reminds us that you don't need to be famous, wealthy, or extraordinary to make a difference. Sometimes, the most powerful way to change the world is by simply caring and acting when you can. Now, imagine if everyone made it a point to do one kind thing each day. Whether it's sharing a meal with someone in need, listening to a friend who's feeling down, or offering a smile to a stranger, these moments matter. When multiplied, they have the potential to spark a movement of kindness that could touch countless lives. How you can make a difference. Ellen didn't wait for a big moment or a grand opportunity. She saw a chance to help and she took it. Her life changed in ways she never expected, and so did the lives of those around her. If her story inspired you, take action today. Start with something simple. A kind word, a helping hand, or a moment of your time. It may seem small, but the ripple effect can be life-changing. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of kindness, you know how much of an impact it can have. Think about how one person's simple act made a difference for you. You can pay it forward just as Ellen did. Whether it's offering to help a neighbor, volunteering, or just lending an ear to someone in need, kindness has a way of coming back to you in the most unexpected and meaningful ways. Join the movement of kindness. If Ellen's journey has moved you, take a moment to reflect on how you can be part of the change. Share your thoughts with us. Has kindness ever changed your life? We'd love to hear your stories. Let's start a conversation about the power of compassion and encourage others to do the same. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with others. By spreading messages of hope and humanity, we can inspire more people to embrace the transformative power of kindness. You never know, your simple act of kindness could change someone's life, just as Ellen's did. Let's be the change we want to see in the world. A little kindness goes a long way, and it starts with you.